This fine morning. I just wanted to read a study by Dr. Bernard Leeman, who carried out a study on the Sabian, which is the Sabayan Aksumite inscription at Adi Kawe, evidence supporting that Sheba and Minilik narrative that we see in the Ethiopian book of the Kebra Negast, which is the Book of Kings. I think that's what it's translated as. So I'm going to read his study and what he's found out, because they found some amazing artifacts in the Middle East, and at that time, the Ethiopian Empire occupied both sides of the Red Sea, so the Middle East and the Horn region. So I'm just going to read it, and how the Kebra Negast is not a myth; it's a factual thing. The Queen of Sheba did come from Ethiopia, and she did go to Solomon, and they did have a child, and they did swap religions. Well, she converted to his religion. And Sheba's son came to Israel and stole and took the Ark of Covenant, which was permitted by God. So I've read the Kebra Negast, and it said how when the Ark of Covenant left Israel, the son left Israel and went to Ethiopia, which is why the sun is more brighter there. That's what it says. So I'm just going to, without further ado, I'm just going to read it. So read extracts of it. Okay? Inscriptions on 750 BCE incense burners. We use a lot of incense. At Adi Kawe, Ethiopia, appear to be linked to the Hebrew Old Testament, and besides confirming ancient Ethiopian traditions concerning King Solomon and Queen of Sheba, may also help solve the present bitter divide in biblical archaeology. Now, the Old Testament has inspired but severely complicated archaeology in its presumed setting of Palestine. 19th century excavation undertaken elsewhere by enthusiasts with preconceived notions had severely damaged evidence at Great Zimbabwe and the probable site of Troy, but a more professional approach was utilized when excavations commenced in Palestine in 1920. Even though their main purpose was to uncover evidence to support the Old Testament record, however, even meticulous archaeologists such as Kathleen Kenyon, who had worked at Great Zimbabwe and expressed her doubts on evidence from biblical Jericho, were convinced that Palestine was the location for Solomon's and... So I'm just going to read it. It's bloody apple. Sorry. Solomon's and Omri's spectacular public edifices. Nevertheless, from the 1970s onwards, the preconceptions were challenged to such an extent that today, biblical scholars are split between minimalists, including some of Israel's leading archaeologists, who argue that the Old Testament record is either total fantasy or at best a highly exaggerated account, and maximalists who believe that evidence have already been or will eventually be forthcoming to support the biblical account. The minimalist stance is particularly contentious as it is interpreted as a threat to the raison d'être of the state of Israel. Yeah, because obviously the occupation of Israel is false and they're not the real Jews. So they don't want this kind of evidence to come out. The Old Testament tells of the Hebrew, a landless enslaved people led to freedom and a divinely ordained promised land under a leader named Moses, who united them under, let's see, the stupid apple thing, you have to scroll up, who united them under a single God and a code of law. Moses' successor, Joshua, conquered the land of Canaan, where the Hebrew intermarried with the defeated population to become Israelites. The Israelites were at first ruled by patriarchs known as judges, but then developed into two kingdoms, Israel and Judah, which were united by a new royal dynasty led by David of the tribe of Judah, and reached a zenith under his son Solomon. The kingdom then split and were in turn destroyed, respectively by the Assyrians in 722 BCE and the Babylonians in 586 BCE. The deported hierarchy of Judah then conspired with the Persians to overthrow the Babylonians and were rewarded with a land grant centered on Jerusalem. If you know your Bible, you know when that happened, guys. So the king would have been Perses. He was the one, or was it Sirius, that allowed the Jews to live in peace when it was overrun by the Persian Empire. Esther, the queen married the Persian. So the Old Testament account from 450 onwards has been verified by archaeological and other evidence, but fierce controversy remains over the pre-exilic period. The maximalist school of thought, almost unchallenged until the 70s, has dominated investigation into Ethiopia and Eritrea's ancient inscription, documents, vocabulary, and religious observance legends that are linked to the Old Testament. The two imperial dynasties of Zagwe, AD 1137 to 1270, and Solomon, 930 BCE and AD 970, so 1270 to 1974, Solomonic Empire, Haile Selassie, that royal line, respectively claim descent from the Hebrew prophet Moses and the Israelite monarch Solomon, probably through Menelik. The culture of both counties is still dominated by the story of the meeting of the Queen of Sheba and the King Solomon. Also, the 6th century Aksumite crusade against the Jewish Messiah in Himyar, Yemen, and the violent Agau pagan Hebraic reaction to monotheist Christian expansion in the 10th century AD under Judith Gudit, and until the 60s, when archaeology in the Holy Land, modern Israel and Palestine, began to undermine the confidence in the Old Testament narrative. Most outsiders dismissed the Ethiopian Eritrean traditions as baseless and recent invention. And we all know why that is, because of racism and anti-blackness, because Israel, became a Zionist nation and just going around using its white privilege and inventing all sorts of fantasy that they're the chosen ones. So embarrassing. And you see the president linking himself to Moses. This is a joke. It's an absolute joke. Like, Moses is a black man. He clearly did a sign. He said, look, I'm going to turn my hand white and then I'm going to turn it brown again. Come on now. Don't at least if you're going to choose a prophet, choose like the palest prophet or something. But yeah. So, as I was saying, during the Ethiopian Civil War of the 1980s, the majority of the Judaic Beta Israel community, many of them part of the huge Ethiopian refugee population in the Sudan, accepted the offer of migration or evacuation to Israel. I mean, it's not like they had any choice. I mean, there was a war going on. They had no say in that. They were just put in a ship, and I doubt they had no choice. It's either die or go to Israel, this whole so-called state. The Beta Israel's religious practices and original text were First Temple, pre-622 BCE, Israelite, not Second Temple, 5th century BCE, Jewish, and consequently assimilation into normative Judaism in Israel has seriously compromised their heritage and identity. In fact, what I heard is when they transported the Ethiopian Jews, they took away all their old books, literally took it off them. Like, that's what white privilege does. Like, white privilege, like, they just literally exert and dominate and took their holy books and then, and then made them assimilate to this fake Jewish religion when their own Hebrew traditions were more in line with with the true practice of Judaism, but they were made to forget, who they were and stop following their old ways. I think the old men still do it secretly, but they had to convert, and that's just so violent because, they don't even follow the right path, and it was just so tragic. It was just what happened to the Beta Israel was just so sad, like how they lost their identity and who they were. They should have just left them to themselves, like not make them walk around wearing blue and white with the Star of David on it and that thing on their head. The Beta Israel never wear that. That's not part of their tradition. So it was just tragic. Personally, I would never have gone to Israel. I don't care. They're they're Ethiopian, and I think they feel more Ethiopian than this fake state of Zion, Israel. So, but again, there was a war going on. They had no choice, and they were literally traded like slavery. Put on they did a deal with the president and said, like, we're taking them, you know, and it's like the people were either dying or they had to get on that horrible ship and I mean the plane, and then you had these white savior Jews claiming, oh, I helped them, I helped integrate them, like they make themselves feel good about themselves, and it's like, no, you destroyed their traditions, and I would never. I mean, personally, it's so sad that they had to give up their true faith and follow this crap religion that is just so distorted. It's not even the truth. Um, it's not about slavery, but what happened with the Ethiopian Jews during the war in the 80s is they did a deal with the president of Ethiopia. They said, okay, we will take the Beta Israel, um, they did some sort of deal. So the whole population was just shipped to Israel. They had no say. They had no freedom. So the reason why I said slavery is like you can just get masses of people and transport them in a state that and what I'm trying to say is they did not have the power to fully consent. It was like a geopolitical thing to take the Beta Israel, and to be honest, the Beta Israel are still Ethiopian. They're more Ethiopian than anything. They were part of a pawn. It's like chess, That's why I meant. Obviously, they weren't turned into slaves, but they were moved from one region to another like slaves. Do you see what I mean? Because they had no power, they had no say in. During that time, there was a Cold War going on. Anyway, so that's the bit of background on this that I'm just giving. So let's have a look. Yes, it has seriously compromised their heritage and identity. And I'm glad people are, white scholars are realizing that, because I've always felt that way about them. While Old Testament scholarship has gravitated between the parameters of the minimalists and the maximalists, I need to go shopping at 10 o'clock. I'm going to be as quick as possible. Hardly any Old Testament academics consider the alternative hypothesis of an Arabian Judah. This paper provides Ethiopian evidence to support the premises that until the Babylonian destruction of Judah in 586 BCE, the events of the Old Testament occurred not in Palestine, but in Western Arabia, and to a lesser extent on the Ethiopian Eritrean plateau, because at that time, the region of so-called Israel was much larger than what it is that we see in the map right now. We know that Judah was Arabia, because I've read the texts, I've read the books, and when they traveled, they went all about those regions. And also parts of Ethiopia was part of Israel, especially during it was. The Hebrew Old Testament was standardized and vocalized in AD 500 and 950 by two priestly families known as the Masoretic scholars, Biblical Hebrew, as the Masoretic scholars. Biblical Hebrew is artificial, a mixture of 5th century BCE Hebrew consonants and 10th century AD Aramaic vowels, and over 350 instances, the Aramaic and the Arabic-speaking compliers admitted they were uncertain what the original unvocalized text meant. However, the Septuagint, the pre-Christian Koine Greek language version, probably from a different source than the standard Masoretic Hebrew text, provides confirmation that the standard Masoretic version adheres to the traditions and beliefs of the post-exilic Jerusalem theocracy of 550 BCE. The editors of the Hebrew Old Testament and the Christian New Testament omitted or suppressed several manuscripts related to their canon. The Gnostic Christian Nag Hammadi Library, unearthed in 1945, is a well-known suppressed example that this has inspired popular literature and films such as the Da Vinci Code. I've read the Gnostic Bible, very interesting. In the case of the Old Testament, some books seem to have been lost, such as the Book of Jasher, or suppressed like the books of Jubilee, which I've read. The book which concerns this paper in the Sheba Menelik cycle, which is a part of the Kebra Negast. I just think it's really, if you read the Bible, you have to read all of this. You've got to read the Kebra Negast, you've got to read the Book of Jubilees, you've got to read the Book of Jasher, you've got to read the Book of Mary. You've got to read all these, and then the Bible will make sense. If you don't read any of these other books, the Bible does not make sense. When you read all these other texts, it kind of like, what's the word? Like you get a better understanding of the truth. But what they did was they chopped and broke up pieces of the Bible so people can be confused and not understand. The Hebrew Old Testament and the Sheba Menelik cycle of the Ethiopian Kebra Negast both record events that occurred during the zenith, about 75 years, of the United Kingdoms of Judah and Israel in the reign of King Solomon. So that's between 956 to 925 BCE. While the Old Testament historical narrative from Moses to Ezra has a time frame of between 800 and 1,000 years, the Sheba Menelik cycle has a span of about 30 years, focusing on the political, theological consequences of the Queen of Sheba's visit to King Solomon in the middle of the 10th century BCE. The Kebra Negast, which contains the Sheba Menelik cycle, enjoys great prestige in Ethiopia. It served as the country's main constitutional document from the 15th century AD until the overthrow of the monarchy in 1974. And this theological influence is even deeper. Conversely, in Eritrea, the Kebra Negast is unpopular because of its association with Haile Selassie. The Kebra Negast was probably compiled in the first part of the 14th century by monotheist Christian clerics in Aksum in the Giz language to bolster the prestige of their benefactors. The restored Solomonic dynasty, it consists of two entwined documents: the Sheba Menelik cycle, which is a Giz translation of an Arabian account of the meeting 3,000 years ago between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba and its political theological consequences. The Caleb cycle, written in AD 520, is in Giz on the eve of the Aksumite crusade against the Himmerite Jewish Messiah Yusuf Asar Yathar Dunwas, and a short colophon explaining why the Kebra Negast was complied and by whom. The Sheba Menelik cycle is the section that concerns Israelite refugees and Shebans in Ethiopia in the 10th century BCE. When the Sheba Menelik cycle is placed alongside the Old Testament account of the events that began with the Exodus and ended with the Babylonian captivity, it appears to offer a plausible solution known as the Arabian-Judah hypothesis to the controversy at present plaguing biblical scholarship. However, while the 520 AD cable cycle is based on undisputed historical events, few non-Ethiopian academics take the contents of the Sheba Menelik cycle seriously. Yet it appears to predate the 7th century BCE. It's an account of the Queen of Sheba's visit to King Solomon, her adoption of the Israelite faith, the birth of their son Menelik, Bina Lechem David, his visit to Solomon as a young man, Solomon's plan for an Israelite state in Ethiopia, the theft of the Ark of Covenant by Azariah, the son of the high priest Zadok, even I know that, Solomon's unsuccessful pursuit, the abdication of Queen of Sheba, and the establishment of the new Zion in Ethiopia under Menelik. Josephus and the Book of Kings summarize the main points apart from the bedding of the queen and its consequences, while Quranic accounts implies that Solomon either annexed Sheba or reduced it to a vassal status. The Old Testament reference in the Sheba-Menelik cycle indicates that it was most probably originally composed before the high priest Hilkiah officiated during the reign of King Josiah of Judah. Because of the Sheba-Menelik cycle, Torah omits the laws listed in the book of Deuteronomy, which most authorities agree was composed during Josiah's reign, albeit utilizing some earlier oral traditions concerning Moses. The omitted laws concern righteous genocide, racial exclusiveness, justification for killing religious deviants, centralization and authority of the temple bureaucracy, and the appointment of judges. The pre-Deuteronomic Torah would therefore have been more palatable to the Queen of Sheba than the final version. The Sheba Torah, in fact, does include some sections of Deuteronomy, namely commandments from chapter 5, some of which are duplicated in Leviticus and Exodus, and in particular chapter 28. However, the Sheba-Menelik cycle places the curses first, followed by the blessings, which is opposite to the Old Testament version, and adds a passage in chapter 41 that cannot be found anywhere else. Hubbard, number 17, in another section of the Sheba-Menelik cycle cites the first part of Deuteronomy 5:14, but finishes the commandment by quoting Exodus 20:10-11. Deuteronomy does not include the reference to the Sabbath mentioned in Exodus 20:11. Hubbard, the leading authority in textual references for the Kebra Negast, suggests that the authors of the Sheba-Menelik cycle were dependent upon memory rather than text. The fact that the citations are accurate and fairly comprehensive is an indication of the high regard for the Mosaic law among the Ethiopians. The Sheba Torah also includes what authorities believe is one of the oldest parts of the Hebrew Old Testament, the Holiness Code, Leviticus 18:28, but interprets some parts of an independent authority way, Hubbard 20. The vast majority of the Old Testament references in the Kebra Negast are in chapters 106 to 111, part of the Caleb cycle drawn from the Christian era Gitter's Old Testament. Hubbard 1956, chapter 25, regarded them as completely unrelated to the Sheba-Menelik cycle. The overall conclusion of the Old Testament references in the Sheba-Menelik cycle is that they most probably belong to an old oral tradition or even a written text predating the 7th century BCE. In contrast, the rest of the Kebra Negast was composed with hundreds of references from Christian era written texts. There is evidence to suggest that the Sheba-Menelik cycle may even date from before Solomon's death, 925 BCE. It does not mention any event that occurred after Solomon's reign and has detailed descriptions of two issues in which the Hebrew Old Testament is silent. Firstly, it explains how the Ark of Covenant was stolen and the route it took to reach Ethiopia. Secondly, why the high priesthood of Judah disappeared during the king's reign. In both cases, this involved Azariah, named in the Sheba-Menelik cycle as the son of Zadok, the high priest. I know my Bible, I got it right. But in the Jewish traditions, the high priest himself, in Jewish traditions, high priesthood did not return to power for 300 years and gives no indication of where it had gone. Had the Sheba-Menelik cycle been composed even a shorter time after Solomon's reign, It most probably would have included examples of some of the disasters recorded in the Old Testament which befell Judah to emphasize the message in the Sheba Milik cycle, that God had abandoned Judah in favor of Milik's Ethiopian kingdom. And that's very important because the son left Israel and went to Ethiopia. And basically God abandoned Israel in favor of Ethiopia. The Sheba Milik cycle appears to have some support from archaeological evidence from Damon, the earliest known state in Ethiopia, which seems to have come into existence before 800 BC. Damot was probably more a collective of people of South Arabian lines than a centralized political unit, and was composed of local and immigrant population. That's wrong. They're all Ethiopians. They occupied both sides. Let's not even go there. Stop calling them Arabians, please. We're not desert dwellers. We don't drag camels. We don't live in tents. We're different. So it is generally believed that its most important center was Yiha, and it was eclipsed by Aksum because possibly Hebraic Damont remained independent of Aksum, playing a major role in the installation of the Agau-Zagau dynasty. The religious affiliation of Ethiopian groups who are complicated by Old Testament maximalists. So basically, if you understand Ethiopian history, there's always been like a rival between the Zagwe dynasty and the Solomonic dynasty. The Solomonic dynasty, we follow the Hebrew lineage, whereas the Zagwe is related but a bit lesser than the Solomonic dynasty. But they're like two rivals, two houses. Yeah, the religious affiliations of Ethiopian groups are complicated. Okay, which was developed as much later date as the exile in Babylon and New Jerusalem, 550 BCE by Ezra and Nehemiah. Ethiopian, Hebraic, and Israeli traditions are all pre-Second Temple, but commentators use Second Temple Judaism criteria to justify their authenticity when Judaism is arguably irrelevant to Ethiopian, Israelite, and Hebrew practices and traditions, which are conceivably older than those of the area of Palestine. Of course, they are. The Solomonic Aksumite Ethiopian dynasty and its ecclesiastical ally, the Orthodox Church, regarded its society as Israelites. That's true. Meaning that it had inherited the political structure and religion of Solomon's United Kingdom, along with its syncretic practices, but later blended them with monotheistic faith of Solomon's descendant, Jesus Christ, creating a Hebraic Christian faith with an Israelite Christian dynasty. We know this. This is common sense. This explains the AD 520 Caleb cycle vitriolic anti-Jewish statements, because the Jewish Himmerite Messiah, Dua Nuaz, not only challenged the Aksumite religion, but also the Aksumite Solomonic claim to be the rightful rulers of Ethiopia. So that's when I mentioned the two houses, the Zagwe and the Solomonic rulers of Ethiopia and Yemen. So at that time it was two lands. They occupied the Middle East and they had the Horn, the whole of Ethiopia and the Horn. The 14th century colophon in the Kebra Negast I never say that word right. Reiterates the view that the restored Solomonic dynasty was Israelite, while the Zagwe was not, because they said the Zagwe was more like indigenous Ethiopian, what's the word? Cushitic. They were more. Some of the most important information about Damot, and maybe also the 10th century AD, 10th century AD, Cushite Agau Hebrew Queen Yodit comes from Adi Kawai, a small village on a rocky promontory 8 kilometers southwest of Wakro in Tigray province. Okay, so Queen Yodit is a Tigray woman. The area is bordered by the north by over 153 rock-hewn monophysite churches dating from the 19th century AD. Yeah. Adi Kawe's church, Abun Garima. Oh, Abuna Garima. Is that where she's from? Okay. Sometimes confused by authorities, including Munuhay, with a large monastery of Abuna Garima near Adwa, contains 3 incense burners inscribed in Bostrafedom Sabian 750 BCE. The 2 larger burners were discovered between 1964 and 1972 at the present site of Wakru, which is being excavated by German archaeologists, and below Wakro 2 on either side of the church. Wakro 1, at about 600 meters below Adikawe, across the valley on a hill on the other side of the tributary of the Gunfal River, is the site of a Sabian temple and the alleged burial place of Queen Yodit, who destroyed Aksum and other Christian centers. Wakro 2 is an unexcavated mound closer to the village and at a similar elevation. The third and smallest incense burner was discovered in the village itself after 1972. The church appears to have been constructed on a much older edifice. The village is sparsely inhabited as most villagers have left to work in urban centers, but one relatively large building is linked to the 14th century Amdas Ion Gabra Meskel of the restored Solomonic dynasty. The unvocalized inscription of the incense burner were initially translated by Roger Schneider. Other researchers have subsequently improved upon his work. The inscriptions state that the Damot was ruled jointly at first by a king, Milkin, Warren Hewitt, and his queen, and then by a series of high kings, Makrib, Riddim, Rabba, with high queens, and Lem. The last 2 sets of monarchs were styled rulers of Damot and Sabiya and Sheba. It's not clear if these rulers were resident in the area of Yaha, which was either the area's political or chief cultic center of both. Authorities concur that Rabha and Leeman were linked to South Arabia. Yeah. As are the deities Ahathar, Alamaka, Da'at, Himiam, Dahat, Badan, mentioned in incense burners. Their subjects were listed on both incense burners as 2 ethnic groups: the Sib, who were the Reds, and the Bra, the Reds. Okay, the Sib, who were the Reds, and the Bra, depending on text direction, who were the Blacks. So basically, it was 2 races: the Reds and the Blacks. So Cushitic and the Semitic, basically, is accepted by all authorities as meaning Sabians, Shibians. Conversely, Bra appears to be an unwelcome word, for no commentator elaborated in Shai. Oh, sorry folks, the battery's dead. Anyways, I gotta go.